2,000 years ago, one civilization held the entire Western world in its grasp. From the misty lands of northern Europe, across the vast plains of Africa, and deep into the ancient cities of the Middle East, its power was absolute. It imposed its laws, its ideas, and even its language on millions. For centuries after its fall, people would dream of its cities, its triumphs, its glory, but also its decadence. This was Rome, a civilization of power and contradiction, a civilization that would shape the world forever. More than 1,000 years after Rome had fallen, another man dreamed of it. The armies of the French Emperor Napoleon marched toward the ancient city. By then, Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was a shadow of its former self, a backwater. But to Napoleon, Rome was something far greater, something almost sacred. He believed he was the spiritual successor of the Roman emperors. He had himself painted wearing the laurel crown, just like Caesar, as if Rome still ruled the world. When his troops entered the city, they met no resistance, no great battle, no heroic defense, only silence. It felt like walking into a ghost town. Among the ruins, frightened citizens huddled. The echoes of a once mighty empire still lingered in crumbling arches and broken palaces. Goats grazed where crowds once roared. The city that had once ruled the world had become a memory. But this memory was powerful, because Rome, at its peak, had been unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the year 70 AD, Emperor Vespasian began building one of the greatest monuments in human history, the Colosseum, a structure so vast it could hold over 60,000 people, a place built not for politics, not for religion, but for spectacle, for violence, for blood. The games held there were unlike anything we can truly imagine. In a single series of events, thousands of people and animals were slaughtered, not in secret, not in war, but as entertainment. The crowd watched, transfixed. Some were horrified, but many were not. They came back again, and again. Even those who were disturbed at first often found themselves drawn in. One observer wrote that instead of turning away from the violence, he stared harder. He became intoxicated by it, addicted. And in that, perhaps, the Romans were not so different from us. Because even today, violence can fascinate. The spectacle, the drama, the raw emotion. Rome simply took it further than anyone else ever dared. Yet Rome was not just brutal. It was massive. At its height, the city had over 1 million inhabitants. It would take nearly 2,000 years before another city reached that size again. But life there was far from glamorous. It was loud, filthy, crowded. Disease was everywhere. The streets were packed with beggars, merchants, animals, and children, and the smell was unforgettable. To deal with this chaos, the Romans became masters of organization. They invented urban planning on a scale never seen before. They built massive warehouses to store food. They created sewage systems to carry waste out of the city. But perhaps their greatest achievement was water. Aqueducts stretched for miles across the landscape, bringing fresh water from distant hills. So much water, in fact, that the supply would not be matched again until modern times. Feeding Rome was another challenge. Every week, thousands of tons of grain were shipped into the city. Massive ships crossed the Mediterranean constantly. The scale of this operation was staggering, and it reflected something even greater. Rome was not just a city, it was the heart of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, an empire connected by roads, trade, and a single system of law. At its peak, you could travel across vast distances using the same currency and the same passport. No other civilization had ever achieved this level of unity. Rome was the world's first true superpower. Its army was unmatched, over 500,000 soldiers, disciplined, relentless, loyal. This was the force that built the empire. and defended it for centuries. Later, empires would study Rome, learn from it, try to imitate it, because Rome's rise and fall held lessons for the future. Napoleon was not alone in his obsession. Across the Atlantic, centuries later, another group of men looked to Rome for inspiration, the founders of the United States. They studied Roman history closely. They admired its republic, its laws, its ideals. They saw in Rome a blueprint, a guide for building something new, something powerful, because Rome was more than an empire. It was an idea that shaped the Western world, its laws, its language, its institutions. Even today, we still live in its shadow. But every empire has a beginning, and Rome's beginnings were anything but glorious. Almost 3,000 years ago, the Italian peninsula was a mysterious place. To the great civilizations of Greece and Egypt, it was unknown, a land of strange peoples and untold riches. Greek traders began to explore it, sailing west into uncharted seas. They called it the land of the evening sun. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected, a civilization already there, advanced, sophisticated, powerful. These were the Etruscans. The Etruscans were unlike anyone else in the ancient world. They built cities, created art, worked metal with incredible skill. Their sculptures were alive with emotion, warm, human. They were not distant figures. They felt real. And they lived differently too. Women had far more freedom than in Greek society. They attended banquets. They shared in public life. Something the Greeks found shocking. But the Etruscans also had a darker side. They practiced rituals that involved blood, human sacrifice. At funerals, slaves were forced to fight. The losers were killed. Their deaths honored the dead. It was brutal. But it was also a tradition that would influence another civilization, a civilization that would rise from the shadows of the Etruscans. A small, struggling settlement, a place that would one day become Rome. The first Romans were not powerful. They were not refined. They were not even particularly civilized. They were tough, stubborn people, living on the edge of survival. They built simple huts from mud and straw. They farmed the land. They fought their neighbors. And they learned. They learned from the Etruscans, from their engineering, their religion, their way of organizing society. But they also inherited something darker, a taste for violence, a belief that power must be shown and feared. Much of what we know about Rome's earliest days comes from stories passed down through generations, stories written centuries later, and one man recorded many of them, a historian named Livy. He lived during the height of the Roman Empire, a time of great power, but also deep anxiety, because even then, Romans feared decline. They saw corruption everywhere, greed, luxury, moral decay, and Livy believed the only way to understand Rome was to look back to its origins. According to legend, Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were abandoned as infants, left to die in the wilderness. But instead of dying, they were saved. A she-wolf found them. She nursed them, protected them, raised them. The image is powerful. Two helpless children, surviving against impossible odds, becoming something greater, something destined. As they grew older, the brothers returned to the place where they had been found, a bend in the river Tiber. There, they decided to build a city, a new beginning, a new future. But almost immediately, conflict began. They argued over who should rule, who would be king. It was a dispute that would define Rome's future, because instead of compromise, it ended in violence. Romulus killed Remus, his own brother, and with that act, Rome was born. A city founded in blood, a city born from fratricide. To later Romans, this was more than just a story. It felt like a warning, a curse, because centuries later, Rome would be torn apart by civil wars, Romans killing Romans, brother against brother. Just like in the legend, the early Romans faced another problem. They had no women. Their settlement was filled with men, outcasts, fugitives, wanderers, people rejected by other societies. But without women, their city could not survive. So Romulus devised a plan, a deception. He invited neighboring tribes to a festival, a celebration of peace. The Sabines came. They brought their families, their daughters. They trusted the invitation. That was their mistake. At a signal, the Romans attacked. They seized the women, kidnapped them, drove off the men, those they didn't kill. It was brutal, but to the Romans, it was necessary. Survival demanded it. These stories shocked Livy. He had hoped to find noble beginnings, virtuous heroes. Instead, he found violence, deception, desperation, and yet, these stories revealed something important. Rome was not built on ideals alone. It was built on struggle, on conflict, on raw human ambition. As Rome grew, it came under the influence of the Etruscans. For nearly 2 centuries, Etruscan kings ruled the city. During this time, Rome began to change. It became more organized, more structured, more powerful. The muddy huts gave way to brick buildings. Trade increased. Wealth flowed in. But Rome was still just one city among many. What set it apart was not its wealth, not its location, but its ability to organize itself. One of the most important figures in this transformation was a king named Servius Tullius. We know very little about him as a person, but his ideas changed everything. He introduced something revolutionary, a census. For the first time, every Roman citizen was counted, recorded, classified. People were grouped according to their wealth, their status, their role in society. This may seem simple today, but at the time, it was extraordinary because it created order, structure, a system. The census did more than just count people. It defined their obligations, their duties to the state, to pay taxes, to serve in the army, to obey the law. But it also gave them something in return: rights, a voice, a stake in the future of Rome. Servius Tullius also created an assembly, a governing body, a place where decisions could be made, where voices could be heard. He called it the Senate. This was the beginning of something new, something that would define Rome's identity. He also organized the army. Each social class was required to provide soldiers. These soldiers were grouped into legions, disciplined, structured, efficient. This was the foundation of Rome's military power, a system that would one day conquer the known world. But Rome was still ruled by kings, and power always invites ambition, always invites betrayal. Servius Tullius himself was murdered, killed as part of a conspiracy. His own daughter played a role. She wanted her husband, Tarquin, to take the throne, and he did. But Tarquin was different. He ruled with fear, with cruelty, with excess. Under his reign, Rome changed, not for the better. Violence increased. Political enemies were eliminated. Power became absolute. And the people began to resent it. The breaking point came with a woman named Lucretia. She was respected, honored, seen as the perfect example of Roman virtue. One night, the king's son attacked her. He threatened her and raped her. The next day, Lucretia told her story, and then she killed herself rather than live with the shame. Her death shocked Rome. It ignited something powerful: anger, rage, a demand for justice. The people rose up. They attacked the royal family. They drove the king out of the city, and they made a decision, one that would change history. Never again would Rome be ruled by a king. Instead, they created something new, a republic, a system where power belonged to the people, where leaders were elected, where no single person could rule forever. Two officials were chosen each year, consuls. They shared power, balanced each other, prevented tyranny. It was a system built on fear of kings, a system designed to limit power. The Roman Republic was born, and with it, a new idea. That government could belong to its citizens. This idea would inspire future generations, future nations. But for Rome, it was just the beginning. Because now that Rome was free, it had to stay free. And for that, it needed something more. Strength, discipline, an army. The wars began almost immediately. The Etruscans tried to take back control. They fought for decades. But they failed. Because Rome had changed. The Roman legions were different. They were disciplined, organized, relentless. They fought not just for survival, but for something greater, their freedom, their republic. And as they fought, Rome grew stronger, more confident, more ambitious. The foundation had been laid. The system was in place. The army was ready. Rome was no longer just a city. It was becoming a force. And soon, it would begin its rise. Begin. Now that Rome had freed itself from kings, it faced a new reality. Freedom was fragile. Enemies were everywhere. And survival depended on strength. For more than a century after the birth of the Republic, Rome was almost constantly at war. Not with distant empires, not with legendary enemies, but with its neighbors, small tribes, nearby cities, former allies, former masters. The Etruscans tried again and again to reclaim Rome, but something had changed. The Romans were no longer subjects, they were citizens, and that made all the difference. They fought differently, not just for land, not just for power, but for something deeply personal, their independence, their identity, their future. The Roman legion became the heart of this new identity. It was not just an army. It was a system, a machine. Each soldier trained relentlessly, each unit structured with precision, each movement calculated. Discipline was everything. In battle, hesitation meant death. Panic meant disaster. So the Romans trained and trained and trained until their movements became instinct, until their reactions became automatic, and they enforced this discipline brutally. If a unit showed cowardice, if soldiers fled the battlefield, punishment was severe. 1 in every 10 men could be selected at random and executed by their own comrades, a practice known as decimation. It was terrifying, but it worked. Because every soldier knew. Standing firm was safer than running, and in the brutal, close combat of the ancient world, that made all the difference. 2 soldiers facing each other with sword and shield might struggle to land a fatal blow, but the moment one turned his back, the fight was over. Roman soldiers did not turn their backs. They held the line, again and again and again. Victory followed, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Rome began to expand beyond its immediate surroundings. One by one, neighboring peoples fell, not always through destruction, often through absorption. This was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Unlike many ancient powers, Rome did not simply destroy its enemies. It incorporated them, turned them into allies, sometimes even citizens. Defeated communities were often given rights, limited at first, but growing over time. They could trade with Rome, serve in its army, benefit from its protection. This created something unique, an expanding network of loyalty, a system where former enemies became part of the Roman world. By the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy. Its influence was spreading fast, its army growing stronger, its confidence rising. But expansion brings consequences, because eventually you run out of small enemies. and begin to encounter larger ones. Hannibal never forgot. As a child, he had watched his people suffer defeat. He had seen Carthage humbled, stripped of its power, forced into submission, and he made a promise, a vow that would shape his entire life. He would never be a friend of Rome. Years later, that promise would turn into action. Hannibal rose quickly through the ranks, a brilliant commander, fearless, intelligent, unpredictable. By the age of 25, he was leading Carthage's armies, and he had a plan so bold, so unexpected, that even the Romans could not imagine it. Instead of attacking Rome by sea, Hannibal would attack by land, but not the easy way, not the direct way. He would march his army across one of the most dangerous natural barriers in the world, the Alps. It was an almost impossible journey. Steep mountains, freezing temperatures, treacherous paths, hostile tribes. And yet, Hannibal did it. In 218 BC, he set out with around 40,000 men, thousands of horses, and something the Romans had never faced before. War elephants. The march was brutal. Men slipped and fell to their deaths. Supplies ran out. Cold and exhaustion took their toll. By the time Hannibal emerged from the mountains into Italy, he had lost nearly half his army, most of his horses, almost all of his elephants. But he had achieved something incredible. He had done the impossible. He had brought war to Rome's doorstep. The Romans were stunned. They had expected conflict. But not this. Not here. Not like this. They quickly raised armies, legions after legions, tens of thousands of soldiers. But Hannibal was ready. What made Hannibal so dangerous was not just his courage. It was his mind. He understood his enemies. He studied them. He anticipated their moves. And then, he exploited their weaknesses. Again and again, he outmaneuvered Roman forces, drawing them into traps, turning their strength against them. The most devastating of these encounters came at the Battle of Cannae. The Romans fielded a massive army, over 80,000 men, one of the largest forces they had ever assembled. Hannibal had fewer troops, but he had a plan. He arranged his forces in a curved formation, a bulging center with strong flanks. As the Romans advanced, they pushed into the center, driving Hannibal's troops backward. It looked like victory, but it was an illusion. Slowly, deliberately, Hannibal's center bent, but did not break. And as the Romans pushed deeper, they became trapped. The Carthaginian flanks closed in, from both sides, then from behind. The Roman army was surrounded, completely. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to retreat. What followed was slaughter. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed, cut down where they stood, trampled, crushed, suffocated. In a single day, Rome lost over 50,000 men. It was one of the worst defeats in its history. The shock was enormous. Panic spread through the city. People feared Hannibal would march straight on Rome, that this was the end. But Hannibal did not attack the city. Why? Historians still debate it. Some say he lacked siege equipment. Others say he believed Rome would collapse without a direct assault. Instead, he stayed in Italy, winning battle after battle, humiliating Roman armies again and again. For 15 years, Hannibal fought on Roman soil, and he never lost a single battle. And yet, Rome did not fall. Because Rome had something Hannibal did not expect: resilience. No matter how many armies were destroyed, Rome raised new ones. No matter how many defeats they suffered, they refused to surrender. They adapted. They changed their strategy. They avoided direct confrontation, wore Hannibal down, slowly, patiently, relentlessly. And then they struck back. A young Roman general named Scipio had been studying Hannibal, learning from him, understanding his tactics, and instead of fighting Hannibal in Italy, he made a daring move. He attacked Carthage itself. This forced Hannibal to return home. After nearly 2 decades of war in Italy, the final battle would take place in Africa. The Battle of Zama. 2 great commanders, 2 great armies. One final confrontation. The year was 202 BC. The long war between Rome and Carthage was about to end. Hannibal had returned home after nearly 20 years of fighting in Italy, after victories that had shaken Rome to its core. Now everything would be decided in one battle, the Battle of Zama. Facing him was a new kind of Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Young, confident, brilliant. But most importantly, he had learned from Hannibal. He understood his enemy, his tactics, his mind. Before the battle, it is said the 2 generals met face to face, 2 of the greatest military minds in history. Hannibal offered terms, peace. Scipio refused. There would be no compromise, only victory or defeat. The armies were evenly matched, around 30,000 men on each side. But there were key differences. Hannibal had elephants, dozens of them, terrifying beasts trained for war. But Scipio had prepared for this. He trained his troops to open lanes in their formation, corridors, so when the elephants charged, they would pass through harmlessly. And that is exactly what happened. The charge began. Thunder, dust, chaos. But instead of smashing into Roman lines, the elephants ran straight through them. The Roman soldiers held their ground, disciplined, calm, prepared, and then the real battle began. Infantry clashed, steel against steel, shield against shield. The outcome hung in the balance until Scipio's cavalry returned. They had driven off Hannibal's horsemen earlier. Now they struck from behind, just like Hannibal had done at Cannae. The Carthaginian army was surrounded. The same tactic, the same trap. But this time, used against him. Hannibal was defeated. It was the end. Carthage was broken, stripped of its power, its navy, its wealth, forced to pay enormous tribute. For decades, Rome had won, but victory was not enough. Years later, Rome returned, and this time, it did not negotiate. It did not show mercy. It destroyed Carthage completely. The city was burned, its people slaughtered, hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved. The great rival of Rome was erased from history. With Carthage gone, there was no power left to challenge Rome. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, and Rome entered a new phase. Not survival, not expansion, domination. Its armies marched further than ever before. Spain, Greece, North Africa, Asia Minor. Everywhere they went, they conquered. And with each victory, Rome grew richer, stronger, more powerful. But something else was happening. Something more subtle, more dangerous. Because conquest brings consequences. The wealth pouring into Rome was unimaginable. Gold, silver, art, luxury goods, and slaves, millions of them. Entire populations were enslaved, taken from their homes, forced to work, on farms, in mines, in cities. At its peak, 1 in every 3 people in the Roman world was a slave. This changed everything. Small farmers, the backbone of early Rome, could not compete. Large estates took over, run by slave labor, cheap, efficient, relentless. And the farmers, they lost everything. Their land, their livelihood, their purpose. Many moved to the city, Rome, looking for work, for survival, for hope. But there was little waiting for them. Only poverty, crowded streets, and desperation. The city swelled, hundreds of thousands, then over 1 million people, a massive urban population, many unemployed, many hungry, many angry. To control this growing mass, Rome introduced a system: free grain. The government distributed food to the poor. And entertainment. Games, spectacles, violence, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed. Keep them distracted. And they will not rebel. It worked. For a time. But beneath the surface, tensions were rising. The gap between rich and poor was growing. The wealthy lived in luxury. Palaces, gardens, endless feasts. The poor lived in cramped apartments. One room. Entire families. Disease spread easily. Fires were common. Life was hard. Rome was becoming a city of extremes. And extremes never last forever. As Rome grew richer, it also grew more unstable. The system that had once made it strong was beginning to crack. Wealth was no longer shared. Power was no longer balanced. A small elite controlled most of the land, most of the money, most of the political influence, and the rest of the population struggled. Among them were former soldiers, men who had fought for Rome, bled for it, won its wars. When they returned home, they found nothing. Their farms gone, their land taken over by wealthy landlords, their livelihoods destroyed. They had sacrificed everything and received nothing in return. This created anger, frustration, resentment, and eventually it led to rebellion. One of the first major crises came in Sicily, a rich agricultural region filled with massive estates, worked by thousands of slaves. These slaves were treated brutally, beaten, starved, worked to exhaustion. Many had once been soldiers, warriors, leaders. Now they were treated like animals. It could not last. In 140 BC, a man named Julius rose up. He was a slave, but he claimed to have visions, to possess divine powers. People listened. He gathered followers, hundreds at first, then thousands. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: tools, weapons, improvised blades, and they attacked. They killed their masters, burned estates, destroyed everything that had oppressed them. The rebellion spread rapidly. Tens of thousands joined. At its peak, the slave army reached over 70,000 men. For years they fought Rome, and for a time, they won. Roman forces struggled to contain them, but eventually, Rome responded. With overwhelming force, the rebellion was crushed. Thousands were killed, many crucified, others thrown from city walls. Julius himself was captured, imprisoned. He died slowly, his body consumed by disease. The message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated, but the problem had not been solved, because the conditions that created it still existed. Inequality, exploitation, desperation. And these tensions were not limited to slaves. They affected citizens too. In Rome itself, a new kind of conflict was emerging: political, social, explosive. At the center of it was a man named Tiberius Gracchus. He was not poor. He was not an outsider. He was part of the elite. But he had seen the problem. He had seen the abandoned farms, the displaced soldiers, the growing inequality. And he wanted to change it. His proposal was radical: take public land and redistribute it to the poor. Give people back their farms, their independence, their dignity. It seemed reasonable, even necessary, but to the elite, it was a threat, because that land was in their hands, and power is rarely given up willingly. Tiberius went directly to the people, bypassed the Senate. That broke an unwritten rule. You did not challenge the system like that, especially not from within. The reaction was swift and violent. A group of senators attacked him, not with swords, but with whatever they could find: benches, sticks, their bare hands. They beat him to death, in public. His body was thrown into the river. It was the first time in centuries that political violence had erupted in Rome itself. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Because Tiberius had shown something dangerous, that power could be challenged, and that the people could be mobilized. His death did not end the movement. It fueled it, and it set a precedent. From now on, politics in Rome would not just be about debate, it would be about power. And increasingly, violence. Rome had crossed a line. Violence had entered politics, and it would not leave. After the death of Tiberius Gracchus, things only got worse. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, tried to continue his work. He pushed for reforms, land redistribution, cheaper grain for the poor, limits on the power of the Senate. But like his brother, he made enemies. And like his brother, he paid the price. Violence erupted again. Thousands were killed. Gaius died as well. The message was clear. Reform wouldn't come peacefully. From that moment on, ambitious men understood something important. If you wanted power in Rome, you needed more than votes. You needed force, and above all, you needed an army. Soon, generals began to rise, not just as military leaders, but as political players. One of the first was Gaius Marius. He changed the Roman army forever. Before Marius, soldiers had to own land, but he opened recruitment to the poor, men with nothing. Rome gave them weapons, training, a salary, and most importantly, hope. But there was a hidden cost. These soldiers no longer fought for Rome. They fought for their general, for the man who paid them, rewarded them, promised them land after victory. Their loyalty shifted from the Republic to individuals, and that change would reshape history. Soon after came another powerful figure, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He did something unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself, not a foreign enemy, Rome. It was the first time a Roman general had attacked his own city, and it worked. Sulla seized power, declared himself dictator. He ruled through fear. Enemies were hunted down, executed, their names written on death lists. Thousands died. When he stepped down, he left behind something dangerous, a precedent. That power could be taken by force, and that the Republic was no longer untouchable. Into this unstable world, a new figure emerged, a man whose name would echo through history, Julius Caesar. He was brilliant, ambitious, and incredibly popular. Caesar formed an alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Together, they controlled Rome. This alliance became known as the First Triumvirate, but alliances built on power rarely last. Crassus died. Tensions grew, and soon, only two men remained, Caesar and Pompey. Rome was heading toward war. The Senate grew afraid of Caesar's power. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar knew that would mean the end, maybe even death. So he made a decision, one that would change everything. In 49 BC, he approached a small river, the Rubicon, a boundary. By law, no general could cross it with an army. To do so was an act of rebellion. Caesar paused. Then he spoke the words, "The die is cast," and crossed. Civil war began. Caesar moved quickly. Pompey fled Rome. The Republic was tearing itself apart, battle after battle, across the Roman world. Until finally, at Pharsalus, Caesar won. Pompey escaped, but not for long. He fled to Egypt, where he was betrayed and killed. When Caesar arrived, he was presented with Pompey's head. Instead of satisfaction, he felt anger. Rome had lost one of its greatest men.
But the war was over. Caesar returned to Rome, victorious, unstoppable. He was declared dictator, not for a year, not for 10 years, for life. The Republic was effectively finished, but not everyone accepted it. Because in Rome, kings were hated, and many believed Caesar had become one. A conspiracy began to form, quietly, carefully, led by men who once supported him, among them Brutus, a man Caesar trusted, a man he considered a friend. The date was set, March 15th, the Ides of March. Inside the Senate, they struck, knives drawn, blades flashing. Caesar fought back, but there were too many. He was stabbed again and again, 23 times. And as he fell, he saw Brutus. His final words, "Et tu, Brute?" Then, silence. Julius Caesar was dead. But instead of saving the Republic, his death destroyed it, because what came next would be even worse. More chaos, more war, and the rise of an empire. Caesar was dead. But Rome was far from peaceful. His assassination did not restore the Republic. It shattered it. Chaos returned to the streets. Fear, uncertainty, power struggles. Because one question remained: who would rule Rome now? Among the many who stepped forward, 3 men stood above the rest. Octavian, the young adopted heir of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally and powerful general, and Lepidus, a skilled, if less famous, statesman. Together, they formed a new alliance, the Second Triumvirate. But this was no quiet political deal. This was a pact of survival and revenge. Their first move was brutal. They hunted down Caesar's assassins, among them Brutus and Cassius. The final confrontation came in 42 BC at the Battle of Philippi. The result: total victory for the triumvirate. Brutus and Cassius were dead. Caesar was avenged, but peace still did not come. Because now, there was no common enemy left, only rivals. Rome was divided. Octavian took the west, Antony ruled the east, and Lepidus was pushed aside. The alliance was breaking, and then everything changed. In Egypt, Mark Antony met a queen, Cleopatra. She was brilliant, charismatic, dangerous, and together they became more than allies. They became a power couple, a threat to Rome. Octavian saw his opportunity. He painted Antony, not as a Roman leader, but as a man corrupted by the East, a traitor, a puppet of Cleopatra. Rome believed him. War was inevitable. In 31 BC, the final clash came. At sea, the Battle of Actium, Octavian's forces against Antony and Cleopatra. The outcome, decisive. Antony's fleet collapsed. Defeat. They fled to Egypt, but there was no escape. With Octavian closing in, they chose their own fate. Mark Antony took his own life. Cleopatra followed soon after. Legend says, by the bite of a snake. With their deaths, the last resistance ended. Octavian stood alone, unchallenged, master of Rome. But he was careful. He had seen what happened to Caesar. He would not call himself king. Instead, he took a different title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. And with that, the Roman Republic quietly ended. In its place, something new was born, the Roman Empire, under Augustus. Rome entered a new age, an age of stability, of expansion, of power unlike anything the world had seen. The Pax Romana, a period of peace that would last for over 200 years. Roads stretched across continents, trade flourished, cities grew, and Rome became the center of the known world. But the cost was freedom. The Republic, with its ideals of shared power, was gone, replaced by one man, one ruler, one empire. And yet, the legacy of Rome never faded. Its laws,
its ideas, its ambition. They would shape civilizations. For thousands of years, even today, we still live in the shadow of Rome.